Hello, and welcome to the ECR Retail Loss Sell More and Lose Less podcast series. My name is Colin Peacock. I've worked in the retail and FMCG business for more than 40 years, working on the dark side of retail on retail loss at every point in the supply chain. Emmeline Taylor, and we're looking at live facial recognition as where the industry's at around the world in terms of its deployment, its use, the business case. And we're going to be looking at three aspects of it. Really, the first aspect would be around just how are organizations getting ready? How are they aligning themselves to what is actually quite a big undertaking? And we'll talk about that in a bit, Emily. The second piece is then how are they building sort of return on investment and a business case? And finally, just as they're looking to scale and roll this out and deploy across many years in the future, what are some of the things that need to be true to continue to win the court of public opinion, in terms of this is the public continue to believe this is a good use of technology, no project creep or other things that could get in the way of undermining, I suppose, trust in retailers and their use of this technology. But let's start with getting ready. And what we're picking up from our conversations and meetings with retailers and trials of retailers that are being reported to us around getting ready, organizational alignment. What are we hearing about that, Emmeline, and what are you hearing and seeing?
Yeah, this is a really important point, and it's one that I think it's a road less travelled in terms of the conversations on live facial recognition. Now, the ECR Retail Loss meeting was attended by a truly international audience. There is global interest in live facial recognition, but one thing that came through those conversations loud and clear is this is certainly not just about flicking on a switch and hey presto, we have live facial recognition. It can be years in the making, and that organizational alignment is really key, because what some of the participants on the call talked about was how tabling the idea of live facial recognition suddenly prompts a retrospective look at all of the policies, procedures that then need to be revisited. Just one case in point around the training of staff or the safeguarding of sensitive data. So one person said, we talked about there being maybe 12 different principles that retailers need to explore to have a safe, ethical and sustainable deployment. And they said each one of those principles would prompt its own working group, its own meetings. So yeah, this is actually quite a big undertaking, but get it right and it could well be worth that investment in time.
Yeah, to your point, there didn't seem to be one sort of like cookie cutter approach. You couldn't sort of like, here's a step-by-step guide to doing facial, because decisions like who do you deploy the alerts to? Do you deploy them directly to store staff, managers, or security guards, or to remote monitoring people? Or do you, that's lots of complications, as you say.
Yeah, and the offerings are so different from the vendors, the algorithms are operating differently. So I think for any business looking to deploy this, they really need to do their homework around how how it actually operates and then what they need to have in place. So there were two really key points of departure. There's some areas around its deployment that is relatively uniform, whether you're in California or whether you're in Auckland, there's some similarities. But the two areas where there's still a lot of diverse activity is around who do the alerts go to? Do they go into the store? Can they be shared with third-party security officers? Is it in a SOC? Is it remotely centralized or not? So that was really key around these alerts. And obviously the performance of LFR is going to be different depending on who gets that alert, because some businesses are saying, we get the alert, it's just for information, it's just for awareness. Whereas others, they get the alert and that then prompts a series of interventions or interactions with a known offender. So that's hugely variant. And the second key area where there's this real divergence is watch lists. Who maintains them? Who has control over them? What warrants somebody being put on a watch list, and for how long? And then how can somebody also be taken off a watch list? So we're seeing a lot of divergence there as well.
Yeah, and I don't think I've yet heard of a project that's taken less than 12 months to actually put together. So it's often it can be 3 years, and someone's going to spend a lot of time doing those 12 meetings, as you say. So it's got to be you got to be quite motivated to do this, right? In terms of
Mm.
just getting ready. Well, let's cover the second area, which is, how do you build a sort of an ROI and a business case? And I think that links back to some of the perhaps tension here or some dilemmas that we might face in terms of what might be seen by others as a sort of business case and what you might see internally.
Yeah, and this is really key, isn't it? Because that business case that might land well internally might not be one that is supported by regulators. So I'd say the key principle for any deployment is around that legitimate use. It has to be proportionate to the reasons why you're using it. And we've seen some cases where the regulators have said using it for things such as fraudulent returns simply doesn't satisfy that legitimate use. Now, it might be good internally, it might have a financial ROI, but regulators are saying, maybe this is more about violence. Maybe it's more around reducing aggression or enhancing in-store safety. That's quite difficult to put an ROI on it. So again, we're seeing these sort of quite murky issues around the ROI, but we did have some figures shared around how it can have a really good return on investment. So one retailer saying that shrink was down by 20%, another saying that their shrink 0.7% to 0.7% in the stores that had been deployed. That's quite a good return on investment, isn't it? But again, it's balancing it with that proportionality. What other types of criminality is it reducing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's worthwhile also thinking through just what the total and the true cost of deploying it is, because it is about cameras, of course, and not everyone's cameras are up to spec. But it's also about just the time and effort of people involved and the governance of the data. There's a lot of cost here. So understanding the true cost of deploying live facial recognition would help. Those numbers certainly were very encouraging. Let's come on to the third area that I wanted to cover here, which is really about, okay, let's imagine that we can get the organizations signed in, everyone loves it, we've got our our privacy piece all on board. We've had it's been interesting. I've not had many meetings with data protection officers before, but we've had quite a few of them recently. So nice to have them on some of our meetings. But then you then built a business case. Yes, we can make this pay out, and the CFO is really happy, and the regulator is really happy. How do we then keep it going, in the future in terms of how do we sustainably scale and deploy this without losing the trust of the public and the court of human or the court of public opinion, I should say. So how do we get that bit right, and what some of the
Yeah.
pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, first off, it was a really welcome addition to have those data people joining the
Yes,
calls. And I
yeah,
think we'll see that more as we move into this age of, intelligence and artificial intelligence being used more frequently in LP and AP strategies. So I think it's a really important dynamic to have those conversations and that input. But in terms of that sustainability, I think what is really key is to move beyond compliance only if you want to have a sustainable deployment, because this is such a fast-paced moving area. And we're seeing several nations now scrambling to try and legislate around the use of LFR and other really powerful AI-driven technologies. So it's about going beyond the bare minimum. Don't use the current regulation as a checklist to work against. Think ahead. What would be a really ethical, privacy first way of deploying this? And key to that is transparency. So where we've seen successful deployments, looking towards New Zealand, for example, they were so key to having the customers on board from the outset. This wasn't about deploying it in the shadows, trying to hide what they were doing. They were upfront. You could not ignore the signage. It's so in your face. There's just nothing to hide here. So I think having that really sensible conversation up front with consumers is so key, because if you don't, that's when the suspicion sets in. That's when people think, oh, they must be doing something a bit dodgy here. You can head off all of that. You can bust all the myths that we have around live facial recognition by having the public on board from the outset. Now, we talked about having these 12 principles, which have been driven from the UK Information Commissioner's Office around surveillance cameras. And I think using those as a launch pad into the discussions around LFR is probably a really good, sensible start to having this sustainable and responsible deployment of such a powerful technology.
Yeah, guess what? Maybe if the criminals start realizing that this technology is there, they might be dissuaded from going into the stores and stealing from them. I did want to touch on, it would seem that it is great technology. Why wouldn't retailers just say, well, the police can have access to it as well, and they can see if there's any missing children, any criminals? This is that a concern, or is that an opportunity? Or how do you see that?
I think it's a real concern around function creep or surveillance creep, as it's sometimes phrased. And I think businesses will really need to be clear and hold the line around who they do share information with. Now, there's some use cases where they say, law enforcement, they're in the store constantly because they want to use our systems. I think we need to be really careful about that and have, clear information sharing agreements in place. I think we're quite fortunate, that you and I have lived through times, of relative, sort of civil, things seem to be relatively fine. We're certainly not living through active war in our locations. But I think that's really important for the public to know the safeguards around who can access this very sensitive personal information and how. Let's ensure that it's for really clear purposes and it doesn't creep into other uses, as attractive as they might be to begin with.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a distinction between live facial recognition and retrospective facial recognition, because I think already retailers are being asked to share CCTV for evidence collection. So maybe there'd be less sensitivity about retrospective, but still those safeguards, to your point, need to be in place. Exciting times, eh?
It's really exciting. I think, use responsibly, use with, through a cynical lens of, being very risk aware of what could potentially happen and mitigating for that. I think this could be a really exciting space to begin to finally tackle those prolific offenders, those organized criminal networks, and those violent offenders that can often move with impunity between different locations because it's almost impossible to track them through just human intervention. So this could be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and my sense, again, the sample we had is 50 or so retailers. If 3 years ago, probably there'd be one or two who were maybe thinking about doing a trial. Today, 5 years later, I think we've got, there are at least sort of 30% in the room who are actually doing it, another sort of 40% about to do it, and the rest sort of waiting in the ring. So it does feel, certainly in USA, UK, New Zealand, maybe soon Australia, Europe, I think, is seemingly less well advantaged at the moment to the use of this technology. But the evangelists and the passion that those who had adopted it spoke about this technology really was quite profound.
It was huge, yeah. And I think, we can definitely draw parallels to CCTV. So if you think back to the 90s, there was a huge, civil liberties questions around CCTV. Is this really desirable? Do we want to have this? Now, fast forward 30 years, and the question is now, why don't you have CCTV? Something happens, there's a crime that takes place, and the public is, well, why didn't we have cameras? I absolutely think that'll be the case in terms of facial recognition in 30 years in those, in those countries that are supportive of it. But it's really about now is the time to ensure that we have minimum standards and that all retailers hold the line on those minimum standards, because otherwise it takes one retailer who goes a bit rogue and then will undo that goodwill from the public and from regulators. So I think this is a real opportunity to get it right for the good of those businesses, but also for the good of communities in which it's operating.
No, thank you very much, Emmeline. Well, we'll speak to each other soon. Really thank you for your time today and for being part of this work. And so we'll speak soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Colin.
Bye. Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all the ECR retail loss community for the sharing of their knowledge, their research and latest learnings to ensure that we become truly a global platform for learning. My name is Colin Peacock. This is the Sell More and Lose Less podcast. And if you liked it, please subscribe so you automatically get all future episodes. And also, if you think your colleagues and friends might also like it, please ask them to follow ECR Retail Loss on LinkedIn and tune in to our next podcasts. If you didn't like it, then let us know and we'll try and fix it. Either way, see you next time. Thank you again.